Well, that's the real reason.
Don't worry, we realise that. Is Sylvie coming up?
I don't know.
Can you tell her we're about to start?
Sure.
She wants to come. She can join us.
Jonathan doesn't get out of bed in the snow.
You got stuck in traffic.
Oh, yes. I think so.
There he is. Okay. Right, so we'll start in just a minute. Got the goodies in. Right, here's David Kennedy.
Hi, David.
Hello, David.
Sound here.
Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, Ralph. I don't get a line across the bottom of all the pictures.
Afternoon, Ralph.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
How are you? There's a reason why I said this down there.
Never mind. All good here. How's it in Bowden?
Cold and snowy.
Cold and snowy, but you're only tier 3 at least.
That's right. Do you know why we're tier 3? Because
I
we
can't see it.
in Manchester.
I can hear, so it's fine.
That's
because
why
what, Rabbi?
we're in tier 3 because we actually have been behaving ourselves. Londoners went 2 to 4 because you've just not. It's been crazy your behaviour of what it is you've been up to. See the scenes of the shops.
Too much fuel. Too
I
much
know.
fuel.
Is your shul open still?
Well, last Shabbos, they opened especially for Bar Mitzvah. And we were encouraged not to go unless we were celebrants.
Right.
Well, there wasn't room, so I couldn't go anyway. And I think that's it now.
Yeah, I think they have that.
I think they're all moist. And yeah, I won't be able to say Kaddish for my late father this Shabbos, which is the first time in 29 years.
David, would you have you got your site this Shabbos?
This Shabbos.
Would you like me to say Kaddish on your behalf of the
If you've
Shabbos?
seen something, I would like that.
Hello.
Thank you.
Yes, okay, I'll do. I've been asked. Last Shabbos I had for somebody in Scotland. Yes, yeah, actually, he was David Feinstein had your side as well, so we did for him. So I'll do on Shabbos for your father.
Hello, David. Wish you long life.
Ralph,
thank you. And
you finish Kaddish for your sister on Friday, don't you?
I think it finishes. Friday will be my 30th day. Yes, finished.
Yeah.
I wish you long life, Ralph.
Yep.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. So we are going to get started. We're doing the second half of the 17th century. Last week we started from the beginning of 1600, and we did a lot of it through the eyes of the life of a Rabbi Yom Tov Lippman Heller, who wrote Tosfos Yom Tov. He wrote a commentary to the Mishnah, and we had a look at the changing of the philosophy. The external events that were taking place then was, of course, we have within astronomy, whether you have Galileo, we just post Copernicus, and the whole argument about whether we are heliocentric or geocentric. And then we had a look at the responsibilities of plagues. There were a number of plagues that took place in Europe at that time. Every single week. Jonathan. I'll mute you again, Jonathan. Sorry. Every week. We can set the time by the clock of Jonathan's phone.
Yeah. Fine. Thank you.
It was your wife, David.
Right. I'm actually going to mute you all. If you want to unmute, you can do, but we're going to mute you for duration. If you need to ask a question, you can unmute yourself for the question. And then we had a look at also the plagues that took place, and we looked at the different aspects of responsibility. And then, which will be important for this week, the commentary written on the Shulchan Aruch. This week, however, we're looking at the second half of the 17th century, from 1648 onwards. Although in order to understand 1648 onwards, we do need to go a little bit back as well. The main events, 3 main events that we're going to look at this week are, number 1, maybe 4. Number 1, you've got the massacres in Poland, the Bogdan Chemnunki massacres from 1648 and 1649. That year was the year 5408, 5409. It started literally just before Rosh Hashanah. And so the 408 and the 409 in Hebrew are Tov Ches and Tov Tes, so they're known as Tach V'Tat. So in rabbinic parlance and rabbinic in Jewish history, the massacres of Tach V'Tat, the terrible events that took place there. The second major event following on from that is the false messiah of Shabtai Tzvi, starting in Turkey, sweeping like wildfire across all of Europe as well, and culminating, and went to Eretz Yisrael, but culminating back again in Constantinople in Turkey. The third event is the renewal of Jewish life in three different areas. Well, the beginning in America, renewal back in England with, and the times of Cromwell and Rabbi Menashe ben Israel. And the third is the great shuls being built in Amsterdam, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi shuls. So those are the three main areas we're going to look at. In order to understand it, I just wanted to go back a little bit with an event that took place by a guy by the name of Baruch Espinosa. Most of you will be aware of Baruch Spinoza. It's called Espinosa initially. In order to understand him, let's just go a little bit further back into the last century. We know we had the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion from Spain in 1492. That then followed on with the Portuguese, not far behind, a couple of decades, and the Portuguese Inquisition in 1536, which caused a lot of the Jews to move along to Holland and Amsterdam, that whole area. And we have a decree made in 1579, decree of toleration by the Union of Utrecht, giving Jews specific permission to settle in that area. And in 1593, in Amsterdam, and many of them came along and they reconverted to Judaism. And we have large shuls being built in Amsterdam about 1598, 1615. A man by the name of Baruch Espinosa, born on the 24th of November, 1632 in Amsterdam. He was initially brought up quite a frum boy. He went to the Talmud Torah school. He received a very good education, but he was struggling, and this is not going to be a philosophy lecture. We're not going to go into too much of the philosophy here, but there was a whole argument about mind and body. Are these two separate entities? And in essence, what Spinoza was arguing, he says, look, I know that my mind exists because I think, therefore I am. But my body may be an apparition. It may be something that my mind has conjured up. It may be the work of the devil. Doesn't actually exist. And he was following off the work of Descartes. Can there have the separation between mind and body? What difference does that make for a Jew? It's, can you separate between Hashem and the world? Because if God is an intellect which exists, does the world really exist from his perspective? Einstein in 1929 was asked, bearing in mind Einstein was Jewish, very Jewish in all of his life. And even though he wasn't a frum Jew, but in it, he pitied the aridity of atheism, deaf, as he put it, to the music of the spheres. But when he asked if he believed in God, and this might help us just to get an understanding of Spinoza, this is 1929. By the way, in 1948, well, not long after the establishment of the state, David Ben-Gurion tried to posthumously rehabilitate Spinoza, and he was met with a crushing sound of thunder from worldwide Jewry, and he dropped it. That's 300 years after Spinoza. But to get a little bit of an understanding, and I might one day ask a friend of mine maybe to give us a little bit of an introduction to philosophy, and he can befuddle us all with Spinoza, Kant, and trying to understand it. But Einstein said, I believe in Spinoza's God who reveals himself in the lawful harmony of the world. Bearing in mind he was a scientist, but not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and the doings of mankind. So Spinoza was not a secular Jew. He was not a non-believer. He wasn't an atheist. He wasn't an agnostic. He wasn't Reform. Reform doesn't yet exist.
What's agnostic?
Agnostic is somebody who's not sure if there is a God or there isn't a God. So questions from the side. An atheist believes, he's adamant, he or she is adamant in their belief that there is no God. An agnostic, at least is honest with himself. An agnostic says, I don't know, there may be, there may not be. Spinoza was absolutely certain that there is a God. But what's his relationship with us? In Amsterdam, in Europe, in the beginning of the 17th century, this was absolutely forbidden, totally and utterly forbidden. So I want to pull up for us here. Let's go to this one here. I'll share in a second. Right, let's share the screen with you. What I love about this is the fact that Spinoza lived where it is now a church. The name of the church is Moshe and Aaron. I don't know what that's got to do with anything, but it really tickled me that the name of the church is Moses and Aaron. So it's supposedly where he lived, but it's the next picture, which is the important one. And this is the ban of Baruch Spinoza in the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, written on the 6th of Av, 5416, the 27th of July, 1656. And it's written there in Portuguese, his ban is, he was totally ostracized. He was put under a cherem, and that meant that you saw him walking down the street, you had to cross to the other side. If there were 9 men in a shul and Baruch Spinoza walked in, you couldn't say Kaddish. You did not have a minyan. To the extent that his name, this is the list of pupils from the Eitz Chaim school. You've got his brother, Itzik Espinoza. Underneath it, Baruch was erased. The community did not want to have any sort of accusation that they were, agreeing with him, that he was, still part and parcel of who they are. And he's totally and utterly eradicated from the community. This is taking place in 1656, although it begins a couple of years earlier. And why is it that he gets so caught up? And why does the community are so adamant to get rid of it? It's because what took place in 1648 in Turkey. But in order to understand what took place in 1648 in Turkey, we need to go to 1648 in Poland. When we go to 1648 in Poland, we have the massacres of Tachbetat, 1648 and 1649, with Bogdan Chmielnicki. And nobody actually knows how to properly pronounce his name, so we just called him Bogdan. His surname is one that we will struggle with. In April, Chai's going to tell me how you told to pronounce it in school?
Chmielnicki.
Chmielnicki. Chmielnicki is how they pronounce it in the Frum schools. Whether or not that is the Polish pronunciation or just the Hasidic pronunciation, the Chmielnicki, I don't know, but Bogdan Chmielnicki.
Was Ukrainian.
He was Ukrainian. He was an Ukrainsky. He was an absolute rascal. In 1635 and again in 1636, we'd had a lot of uprisings, the local peasants and the Cossacks in Ukraine. The Cossacks were skilled. They were warlike horsemen. My father, if he ever wanted to refer to somebody as being a Blegich, he would call them a Cossack. They really were. Although I remember in yeshiva, we were taught how the Cossacks chose their horses. Although later on I found out that it wasn't the Cossacks, it was actually the farther east, and they came around. Tatars, yeah, no, but they came from, what was the guy in
Asia?
In Asia, yeah. What was it? What was his name? Jonathan, if you want to help me out, the kids are trying to remember the word.
The Mongols.
Thank you very much. The Mongols.
Oh yes.
When they wanted to choose their horses, what they would do, they would capture the wild horses. You know, if it had been America, it'd be in the prairie. If it'd be in Asia, on the steeps of Asia, and they would herd them towards a gushing river. Not all of them would survive. Only a couple would get over. But then of those few that got over, there would be a small percentage of them that would turn around and would see their fellow horses struggling and would go back into the river to help get one of the other horses out. It was those few who survived and went back in to help somebody else that they took to choose their horses. So as I said, in Yeshiva, we were told this was the Cossacks, and it was explained to us from a Hasidic perspective. In order to be strong, to go out into war, those that go to battle for the house of David, it's not enough to survive the torrent. You've got to then be able to turn back behind you and see who's struggling. Ralph, I did it to the top of your road today, walking home from shul. I wouldn't drive in my car, but get to the top of Ralph's road, and there was a car struggling to get out from the ice. I went back, walked on the road to push him up, and hurt my finger. But you've got to be able to go back into the stream in order to help others. The Cossacks were rising up against their Polish overlords who were charging them. I mean, the system that was in place there at that time was so undemocratic. The problem was that it was the Jews who were collecting the taxes on behalf of the Polish nobles. It was the Jews who were the only ones who were trusted to run the inn, the arenda. You're not going to give it over to a regular Polish farmer. He can't read or write. He can't add up, and he's not going to be trusted with A, the profits, or B, more importantly, even with the stock. If you put a Polish farmer inside a tavern and tell him he's responsible for all of the alcohol, none of it would be sold. And so the Jews were the ones that were doing it. They were the ones that were running the business. They owned no land themselves. They were as beholden to the Polish overlords as the farmers were. And in fact, they at that point were always on the belief of turn the other cheek. I know you might think this is a Christian concept, but especially since 1492 onwards, the Jews of Eastern Europe said, let's live quietly. Something is always going to happen. It's a price that we pay to be able to be allowed to stay here and practice Judaism. So they turned the other cheek. They weren't the overlords. They weren't in charge, but they were the public face of the nobles. So when the Cossacks rose up, they were going against the Polish nobles, but it was the Jews that bore the brunt of it. So much so that in one day alone, on the 20th of Sivan, 1649, the uprising was pretty much put down already. 6,000 Jews were murdered in Nemirov. Overall, in the course of 1 year, just over 12 months, 300 Jewish communities and 100,000 Jews were murdered. Bearing in mind, Polish Jewry, Eastern European Jewry at that point was just over 1 million. This was 10% of what was going to happen. There is a footnote by Beryl Wine. So Beryl Wine has written 3 books on history. We're up to the 3rd one, which is The Triumph of Survival. Recommend borrowing them and reading them. And he has a footnote over here saying that thus the obstinacy of the Jews was welcomed by the murderous Cossack mobs, who obliged with the greatest single slaughter of Jews from the times of the Roman conquest in 70 and 135 until the time of Hitler in 1940. Footnote number 9. He says, one must take into account that the means for mass slaughter available to the Cossacks in 1648 to 1649 were rather primitive. Everybody had to be dispatched individually by sword or musket. And it's this last sentence which I'm guessing he wrote it tongue-in-cheek or with the stark reality of what the truth was. Concentration camps, machine guns, gas chambers, and crematoria would have to wait a later and more advanced form of civilization. And that was the tragedy of the Holocaust. They were an advanced form of civilization. In fact, so much so, the main complaint sent along to Hitler in 39, 40, and 41 was that the morale against this, the soldiers on the front, their morale was dropping. Why? Because although they were winning the war, they were having to individually shoot the Jews that they captured. And there was a French priest who wrote a book called The Holocaust by Bullets. And he went along and it was counted because the 6 million that we know of, a majority of them are from the camps where the names were written down. The Urgensatzer, who went ahead before the final solution was done, who went ahead of them all and literally just rounded the Jews up and shot them. We know of the big ones that you've got at Baba Yar, but many of the others weren't. So in 1648, this is what they were doing with bayonet. It was terrible of the troubles that we're doing. Now the Cossacks aligned up with the Tartars. The Tartars were in Crimea. They'd come along from, they were the descendants of the Mongols. They'd come from the Asian steppes. It ended up in Crimea. We learned 10 centuries earlier on about the Jewish kingdom of the Khazari, which they'd come over. They weren't that far away from Crimea as well. And we have a number of them living in Crimea. They joined together. The Cossacks were bloodthirsty. The Tartars were a lot more financially minded. So Jews preferred to be caught by the Tartars than the Cossacks because the Tartars would sell them off into captivity. And whilst they ended up penniless at sometimes on the other side of the world, they went along all the Jewish communities on the Mediterranean coast, bearing in mind they were from where? They were from Eastern Europe. So we sent them to Rome, Bologna, Venice, Casablanca, Tunis, Salonika, Aleppo, and Jerusalem. They ended up there penniless, but at least they were alive. Kids, you may want to step out because I'm about to read a little segment of, if they're going to listen there, of the tortures that the Cossacks did during this time. Some were skinned alive, and this is by a contemporary author writing of what took place, contemporary, I think, within about 50 years or so. Some were skinned alive. Their flesh was thrown to the dogs. Some had their limbs and hands chopped off. The bodies thrown on the road to be crushed by wagons and horses. Some had wounds cut deep into them, were then thrown on the street to die a slow death, writhing in their blood and agony until they breathed their last. Others were simply buried alive. The next 4 sentences I'm not going to read because it gets even worse. But the deprivations of 1648 and 1649, the overwhelming slaughter that taken place over there was terrible. But what's interesting is that the Cossacks hadn't learned the lesson. Since the time of Purim, it was probably the first time, from the time of Purim onwards. So we're talking about in between the first and the second temple, we're at the 5th century BCE. If Jews are told, apostatize or die, we always agree, we always gave up our lives. We were fighters, you know. The defeats against the mighty Greek army, we just celebrated Hanukkah, by Judah the Maccabee was unheard of. For the mighty Greek army to be turned around by a group of, as we say in Al Hanisim, Rabim Biad Me'atim, the many in the hands of the few, Giborim Biad Chaloshim, the mighty in the hands of the weak. That was unheard of. But Jews fought for their religion. They were always going to. Think of Masada. Think of in Jerusalem, if not for infighting, Jerusalem in the year 70 would not have fallen to the Romans. In fact, some of the depravity of the destruction of the second base of Mikdash was because the Roman did not understand how they were being defeated by the Jews. We've always fought to defend our homeland and our religion. The one thing that unfortunately has always undermined us is honey. The non-Jews are a lot better off defeating us with the honey rather than with the carrot, rather than the stick. When Jews are, make life a little bit easier. Think of the Enlightenment. Think of the problems in Germany in the 1800s rather than the 1900s. What that did to European Jewry was, from one aspect, it was not as bad, but it was terrible. I mean, some could even say it's one led to the other. But the depravity of it there, and the problem was that we refused to give in to the Cossacks. We refused to actually, sorry, just put it in silent, apostatize. And this infuriated the Cossacks so much so that any who did, and then just in order to hide, and then went back to being Jewish, the Cossacks went so mad that they actually started killing any who had apostatized as well. But what did this do? What was the end result of 1648 and 1649? By the way, Bogdan, in 1654, there was a battle in Poland by another country who fought against the Poles in 1654. I don't think they've ever been in another fight since. Correct. Chai Bracha got it. Jonathan, you'll have to unmute yourself. If you press the
Swiss.
No, not the Swiss.
Oh, Swedes.
Swedes.
Ah.
Swedes. The Swedish fought against them, and Bogdan Chmelnytsky sided with the Swedes in 1654. He dies in 1657. Typical to Jewish life, when the Poles finally did defeat them, they turned around and blamed the Jews because for siding with the Cossacks and the Tartars. But you know what? That's sort of what we were expecting. In 1652, the Tartars reversed, rejoined Bogdan, went back to them. It went there and back, and until 1655, Jewish life in Poland was terrible. By 1655 onwards, it had calmed down. And actually, between 1655 and 1939, Jewish life in Poland was very good. Although what happened then was a harbinger of what was about to come next. There is an interesting outcome, though, from a religious Jewish perspective of the massacres in Poland in the 17th century. In the previous century, we had Rabbi Yosef Karo authored the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. And because it was not long after the printing press had happened, it was seen as a sign of an Orthodox house. You buy your own Shulchan Aruch. But many were unhappy with this because don't need a rabbi anymore. Just open up the Shulchan Aruch and see what it is. It's basically, it's the same as Google nowadays. Don't need a rabbi anymore. I have to tell you, it's not unheard of. It happens to me. It has happened to me a couple of times, and this is a good one. When I get a phone call from a congregant who rings me up, has a question, but then says, "Rabbi, this was a question. I went into Google and this is the answer. Can you please sign off on it?" Sometimes yes, sometimes no. There was one person that asked me, I said, "I'm sorry, I just can't." But I said, yes. But as Abraham Lincoln said, I even have a recording of him doing it. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. No, is that? See, the problem with having muted you all, I can only see the smile on face. I can't actually hear the laughter.
Very funny, very funny.
Thank you very much. At least David enjoyed that. But that was the problem now. When the Shulchan Aruch was printed, they had the same problem. I don't need it anymore. Of course, in those days, they were also a lot more learned. However, when the Ramah had written on it, but two of the people who suffered terribly in 1648 were the ones that we learned last week, the Shach and the Taz, Reb Shabsai Cohen, who wrote his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch age 24, and Reb David Halevi, the Taz, who in the same year, unbeknownst to each other, they both wrote it, the Taz being much, much older, they write it in 1646. After 1648, they realized that, you know what? It's good that every Jewish household has a Shulchan Aruch, because a lot of the rabbis lost their lives. A lot of the great centers of learning had been destroyed. A lot of people found themselves, having run away, found themselves unable. You couldn't pick up the phone. You may be living in your Huppetsville. There's no Rav nearby. Having a knowledge of halacha, having a Shulchan Aruch that set it out right there was extremely useful. To reconnect it back to our days, there was no longer an excuse when we get upstairs at 120 to turn around and say, but I didn't have a proper education, I didn't know. Everything, you've got to know where, it's like with anything, you've got to have the correct book in order to be able to know what you're doing. You've got to know the correct website to go to, but having easy access. So if you think back to your childhood, think to the first time you had the British Encyclopedia, yeah? And now, and I guess you probably also remember the first time was Encarta, put it on a disc. All of a sudden, wow, now it's not just on a disc, wherever you are, that's it, it's on your phone, you've got the answers right there and then. Exactly the same thing took place within the Orthodox Jewish world. Orthodox is the wrong word because Orthodox didn't exist, but Judaism as a whole, with the Shulchan Aruch, but it was only seen as being a positive after the destruction of 1648. And the other thing it did was the Ashkenazi-Sephardi divide. From 1492 onwards, the Ashkenazim had looked at the Sephardim down their noses. They looked down their noses at the Sephardim because in the run-up to 1492 and the expulsion from Spain, Spanish Jewry, whilst not being assimilated, had become far more integrated. Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory said that one thing brilliantly that Jews in England did was we learned how to integrate without assimilating. The Ashkenazim looked at what had happened in Spain in the run-up to 1492. Also, they're dabbling with the Kabbalah. And they said that the expulsion in 1492 was divine retribution. And they've been maintaining that for nearly 200 years. All of a sudden, they'd been visited upon something similar. The massacres of 48 and 49, and they couldn't turn around and say, well, that was because we'd become irreligious. Bear in mind, I mentioned Spinoza. That was afterwards in Amsterdam as well, not in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, up until 1648, and then continued on, they were Orthodox Jews. Orthodoxy maintained up until 1939. A Jew you met in Poland was going to be a Frum Jew. A Jew you met in Germany Jew you met in Vienna in 1938 was 90% likely to have married out. A Jew you met in Eastern Europe, and that's what Fiddler on the Roof is based on. Because they didn't do it. It was the first time, Shalom Aleichem is making fun. When the first time when she makes her own shidduch, that was sacrilege. Then the next time it's not from, the third time it's not Jewish. But he was making fun of it because that's what it was like. We were from. So in 1648, when Eastern European Jewry, let's leave aside Germany and what took place more along to the west. Let's leave aside Amsterdam, which was a lot more cultured, and therefore you had more of an issue. So the Ashkenazim couldn't now say this was divine retribution for becoming too modern. And so therefore they looked at the Spanish and the Sephardim and they said, maybe. So ken doch sein, it's possible that the Spanish Inquisition was not because of their lacks in their Judaism. Before I continue on with Shabtai Tzvi, said of the two Jewish communities that were found at this point. Let's see, here's one here. One of them is the Jewish community in America. In 1641, we have a man by the name of Aaron Levy, who lands, he's coming from Portugal. He moves his way along to northwest New Granada, and he's going through South America, and they meet Indians. The problem is that these Indians greet them in supposedly Hebrew. And their declaration that they say to them, at least according to good old Simon Sharma and the research that he has done, is the fact that their declaration there was Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. They said that they were the descendants of Avram, Yitzchak, Yisrael, rather than Yaakov, Avram, Yisrael, and Reuven. They were they claimed to be one of the 10 lost tribes. How, who, what, when, and there, I'm not too sure. But they saw these as being the first of the 10 lost tribes having been found. And they speak a lot about the Sambatyon River. Now, according to Jewish lore, Lore, the 10 lost tribes, after they were banished, were put on the other side of the Sambatyon River, which all week long would hurl rocks into the air. Except on Shabbos, it would calm down. But if you tried to cross it on Shabbos, it would hurl rocks at you as well. No Jew was allowed to cross over onto the other side. We have here, where is he? Make sure I get the right one. Here. We'll get to Menashe ben Yisrael just a second. We'll get to that in a minute. But
Sorry, right. What year did you say this was that they went to America?
1641. This is Montesinos was released in September 1601, and he sets out for the interior and the river of Honda. He crossed over the river port of Honda. He crossed the Magdalena River, and he found the Indians chewing cocoa. And they came across these people there who were supposedly, they were Jews from the tribe of Reuven. They were speaking within Hebrew to one another, and their daily prayer was Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad.
Rabbi,
Yes, Jonathan.
which is the Sambatyon River?
The Sambatyon River. Ain't nobody knows.
Okay.
I've got no idea. As a
Europe
kid,
or was it America?
right. So as a kid, I was neither. As a kid, we were brought up to say that it was a tributary of the Euphrates because we went east.
Yeah.
According to this,
Yeah.
it was part of the Amazon River because they went west
Yes.
in order to get them over there. So who knows where it was, but this is the Sambatyon River. And we'll leave them alone for the moment. So there, Montesinos comes back from America, and in 1644, he tells a certain rabbi by the name of Menashe ben Yisrael. Menashe ben Yisrael is a rabbi in Amsterdam, and he's aware of Jews being everywhere. He's already aware of the Sambatyon River, and he had been told by his father of an hourglass with the sand shook itself for 6 days, on the 7th day, it refused to work. And there would be a man who would run through the streets of Lisbon on a Friday afternoon, showing the conversos in Lisbon that they'd had to leave in 1536. He's now 1644. His father tells him so, maybe 10 years earlier on, of a man that had an hourglass with sand from the Sambatyon River, and they would be able to see when they have to shut the shops for Shabbos, because when the sand stops running through the hourglass, it must be Shabbos. But Menashe ben Israel knows of Jews being everywhere, but there is one country in his immediate sphere where they're not. Bearing in mind, they already know of Jews in China, Jews in India. I mean, there are some beautiful Cochin, some beautiful shuls in that area. You can go and visit them still today, of the beautiful shuls that you've got all the way over in the Far East. And we know of Marco Polo was in touch with them. We know that Genghis Khan, finally, it's only taken 40 minutes, but his name has finally come back in. Genghis Khan definitely came into contact with Jews when he was going eastwards. We know that there was lovely Jewish communities all over the place in China and India. Now he's been told that Jews have reached the New World as well. We'll leave aside the possibility that Columbus might have been Jewish. We'll leave that aside. Of course, it's right at this time as well that the first ships from Amsterdam land in New Amsterdam, as it was called at that point until it became Manhattan. In New York, they landed in New Amsterdam, and the shuls do get set up in the second half of the 17th century. But Menashe knows of another place in his immediate vicinity where Jews are not allowed to live. That, of course, is... Hit the space bar on your computer. It should temporarily unmute you.
I'm so sorry. Can you just repeat the question? Just repeat the sentence.
Menashe ben Israel knows of one further country in his immediate vicinity where Jews are not allowed to live.
What year we're talking about?
1644.
England.
Oh, Britannia, Britannia.
Oh.
England.
England. Good old England. Ekland, the end of the world. We'd been booted out in 1290. It's 1650. We're not allowed to live there at the moment. Menashe writes in 1656. He writes Vindicare Judorium in order to advance the quest of Jews. And he says, our universal dispersion being a necessary circumstance to be fulfilled before the Messiah can come, playing very much on the Protestant feelings of England. You want the Messiah to turn up. Jews need to be in everywhere of the world. And I conceive that by the end of the earth, as the Pasuk in Devarim, then he quotes from Daniel as well, that Jews have got to go to the end of the world. England got its name at that point. It was England. It was the end of the world before they'd discovered or knew about America, the New World. We'd been booted out of there. He applied himself in all zealous affection to the English nation, congratulating them on their glorious liberty, which at this day they enjoy. Now, for Menashe, there was something more important. He had calculated that Mashiach had to come possibly 1648, that had already happened, otherwise 1656 was, according to Menashe ben Yisrael, a day when Mashiach had to arrive. He's now in 1656. He writes to England telling them that we have to actually allow the Jews back in. You've got so many other forces at play in England at that time, one who weren't too happy with it. One of them were Jews. The handful of Jewish families who were living in London under New Christian cover. By the way, when we were booted out in 1290, we didn't all go. There were some who remained, and even more after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, a number did come over to England. They were living in London, and the authorities knew that they were living in London, but as long as they kept quiet, they never had a minion. They were very quiet there. They did not want to be revealed, and the government at that time was the Stuart government, lets them worship discreetly in private houses. And for many of them, that was enough. They didn't want everything to be ruffled. It seems there and back as to when exactly the date you could say we were allowed back into England is very confusing because it happens gradually between 1654, 55, 56, and 57. It takes a number of years for it to, it's never really, it's not like, we know the date we're booted out, but nobody seriously sort of, and I've been able to find, signed a date from today henceforth, the members of the Jewish faith shall be allowed to live in England. It was sort of de facto that they were bit by bit allowed back in. In 1657, make sure we get the right one. Early in November 1655, he put the matter to the Council of State. Is it lawful to admit the Jews? Under what conditions might they be permitted to reside and trade in the Commonwealth? So it's never sort of like, yes, we're allowed to, but should we sort of let them in? And part of the fears of what the Jews were going to do, that they were going to use their filthy money, or as they called it, the filthy lucre, L-U-C-R-E, their wealth, to buy St. Paul's Cathedral and the Bodleian Library, where all the Hebrew manuscripts would be. They would get the whole village of Brentford for the London ghetto. They started to look into the Davidic descent of Oliver Cromwell's. Is he going to be the redeeming Messiah or not? So there were a lot of forces at play. Eventually, in 1657, they do buy a plot of land in Mile End to be used for what do you think it's going to be used for?
Mikveh.
Nah.
Oh, burial ground.
Bingo. To be used as a burial ground. There was not really a decisive utterance from Cromwell. In 1657, land was bought in Mile End in the East End of London for the first cemetery plot, Jewish cemetery plot. It's now within the grounds of the Queen Mary College on Mile End Road. Unfortunately, it wasn't opened up quickly enough to accommodate Reb Menashe ben Yisrael's son, Shmuel, who dies that year. Shmuel had anyway been asked to be taken back to Amsterdam, and he's buried there 2 months later. And bearing in mind, Menashe had already said that Mashiach was supposed to come in 1656. We're now to 1657. Mashiach hasn't yet come. And Menashe ben Israel passes away, although, as Simon Schama writes it, he too passed into the paradise garden and was taken to the house of life at Uderderk and set beside his father. Eventually, England does become a green pastures, and did those feet in ancient time walk on England's green fields? Yes, we do walk on England's green fields unless they're covered in snow. And interesting, just before we leave England alone and go back to Europe and Shabtai Tzvi, there was one of the problems that the non-Jews had with the Jews coming back to England was the Kol Nidre prayer. The problem with the Kol Nidre prayer is it says Kol Nidre v'esrei, any vows or oaths that we make will be nulled. And they took that and they translated as being that all of our business contracts, including our debts, become nullified and void every Yom Kippur. So therefore, they didn't want to do business with the Jews. Of course, that's not what it means at all, but that is what the accusation of what it was that they were going to be doing. We're leaving England alone, and we're going to jump along to Turkey and a certain man by the name of Shabtai Tzvi. He's born in 1626 in a place called Smyrna, S-M-Y-R-N-A, Smyrna, Turkey. By the age of 20, it seemed he was already ordained as a chacham, as the equivalent of the rabbi. Some argue whether or not he was ordained, but he was definitely recognized as being a Talmud chacham. He was a clever, learned person. As we know, the line between brilliance and insanity is often very, very fine. He was, by all accounts, a genius and who snapped. He became schizophrenic, but he had his first messianic delusions in 1648. So by this point, he's 22 years old. It's the first time he starts dreaming about Mashiach, but does nothing about it. 2 years later, he almost drowns swimming off the coast in Smyrna. And he gets rescued, and because of that, he says, about the great miracles that was going to happen to him. Did anybody ever hear Rabbi Sachs tell the story of when he nearly drowned on his honeymoon?
I was just thinking of the comparison.
Yep.
He didn't consider himself Bashir.
No, he didn't.
Yeah.
And what he thought to himself was, how do you say help in Italian? But he realized that from that day on, he had something to live for in his responsibility. Shabtai Tzvi says, this must prove I'm the Mashiach. But in 1651, only 3 years after he first made any stupid proclamation, he is banished by the rabbis in Turkey, and he wanders for the next 7 years. In 1658, he ends up in Constantinople. As with everything in history, History is made up of two things being in the same place at the same time, or if not in the same place, of interacting with each other. You often need to have a confluence of occurrences in order for the great events to take place. Just think of what started World War One. There needed to be so many ingredients in place. Here, Shabtai Tzvi needed one more man. That is Nosson Nathan of Gaza, a well-known and respected Kabbalist. In 1663, he meets Shabtai Tzvi for the first time. By that point, Shabtai is 37 years old. He is already schizophrenic, and he goes along to see Nathan sort of to get a little bit of help. Nathan's a Kabbalist, and he was suffering from visions and questions with his own life. And 2 years later, Nathan gives him a prophecy. His prophecy was that you are the Mashiach. Shabtai Tzvi was ripe for the picking. It fell into his lap brilliantly, and over the next couple of years, he went totally crazy. He married a Sefer Torah. At the marriage ceremony, he makes a bracha, pronouncing Hashem's name, the ineffable name of Hashem, properly. And he says, Matir Asurim, who has permitted that which is forbidden, takes Chelev, which is the forbidden fats of the animal, makes a bracha on it, and eats it. By the age of 22, by the way, he'd been married twice, both marriages having ended in divorce because he couldn't consummate the marriage. He leaves behind no children whatsoever. Shabtai Tzvi went mad from one to the other. The problem was Jews were ripe for a messianic vision. And there is very limited opposition to it. The most vocal one at that point is a man by the name of Rabbi Jacob Sasportas, who rallies against it. However, should we get the right page? There was one person, famous unbeliever. This is in Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas was a descendant of Nachmanides, Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who was the great defender of the Talmud in the debate in Barcelona that we learned about in 1263. And he, unfortunately, it doesn't really help. And you had they would read out a prayer. We have the Queen's Prayer. They would read out a prayer for Shabtai Tzvi every Shabbos, Mondays and Thursdays. They started reading out. And if you didn't believe, you walked out of the shul. That was the most that they could do. There was one famous unbeliever merchant by the name of Alatino who went mad at them. He says, you're singing, what's happening? Where's Eliyahu Novi? One morning, he'd been to the Borsa. It's in Amsterdam. He'd been to the Borsa. He washes his hands to say Hamoitzi, about to eat the bread. He has a massive heart attack and drops dead on the spot. You can just imagine what that did to those who were saying that Shabtai Tzvi was the Mashiach. There was another very wealthy man who also, he goes home and he finds out that two of his daughters now are starting to get prophecies. And I say, anybody that wanted to make a name for themselves had a seizure, rolled their eyes back, foamed at the mouth, and started telling them, this Shabtai Tzvi is going. It swept through European Jewry. He's in Turkey, it goes to Israel, and he goes across to the whole of Europe, leaving most of Eastern Europe alone, but all of Amsterdam, Jews that were living in Germany at that time, France, Italy, all get caught up with it. They sell their houses. They change all of their wealth to being portable wealth in order to go along with him. We'll leave aside some of the other crazy Mishigas. If you want to read it in a very easy to read format, it's been put into a novel form called The Imposter. It's part of a series of books following a fictional family, the Puchula family in Europe, but in Eastern Europe. But it deals, this one here, it's one. And how many books are there then? 10, 12 books are there. It's one of them. And he delves into what went wrong there. But in March 1666, the Sultan imprisons him. He says, if I murder him, he'll become a martyr. Let me just imprison him and let it fizzle out. Unfortunately, when he gets imprisoned in a dungeon called Gallipoli, he uses his vast wealth. People sent him money. He amassed a fortune. He bribes the palace guards. He turns his dungeon into a palace. Of course, because of that, Nathan and the others who were proclaiming him says, look at the power of the Messiah. Even the Sultan can't do anything against him. But after a couple of years, the Sultan gets some complaints from the Jews and the non-Jews, and eventually Shabtai decreed that not only the 17th of Tammuz, but also his birthday, claimed to have been born on Tisha B'Av, will be changed from a fast to a feast, and he goes through everything, all the rejoicing was meant to take place. Mid-September, Shabtai is brought to Adrianople, which is the summer resort of the Sultan. And Sultan Mehmed IV watches as Shabtai is confronted by the governor of Adrianople and the court preacher Mehmed Vani Effendi. And Shabtai is told at that point that he's going to be made a target of the Sultan's archers. If he's the Messiah, then the arrows would bounce harmlessly off him. If you think of the trials of the witches in England, we'll put you in, if you drown, then obviously you're not a witch. So if you're all right, if you're the Messiah, the arrows will bounce harmlessly off you and they would acknowledge the truth. If he declined that test, then he would be taken to the impaling stake set up at the Seraglio gate. Another account says that the alternative was that he would be marched through the streets of the city with flaming torches pinned to him, burning away his flesh. So an impaling stake, how do you describe an impaling stake? I think it's a sharp stick that gets shoved up your tuchus until you die. That's an impaling stake. Not a nice way to go. So he was offered either that they would shoot archers at him, they'd bounce off, or they were going to murder him in a ghastly way. Third alternative, which was to apostatize. Shabtai immediately takes off his hat, tramples it underfoot, puts on the white turban of a Kapichki Bashi, the gatekeeper of the palace, which was quite an honor, and his name was changed to Mehmed Effendi Pasha. He gets given a purse of silver. Everything's all right for him. Unfortunately, over the next few years, they said, well, this was the end of Mashiach ben Yosef. He's going to come back as Mashiach ben David. He needs to have a second coming. This was part and parcel of the fight between Gog and Magog. Shabtai is not done yet. We're going to leave him alone. Unfortunately, in the beginning of the next century, 1700, it causes a massive fight between a number of rabbis, and you've got the great controversy of Reb Yaakov Enden and Reb Yonis and Eibeshitz, which we'll learn about that from in the 1700s. And it also caused a lot of the problems when in the 18th century, in the 1700s, you have the Baal Shem Tov, the beginning of Hasidism, and their fear that this was another Shabtai Tzvi. But I want to jump back for the last couple of minutes to Amsterdam. Take us after this event to here was 1671, when the Jews in Amsterdam, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, by the way, the Spanish and Portuguese shul in Amsterdam started doing the duchening on every Shabbos. So we know in Wicker Lane, the Sephardim do it every Shabbos. The Spanish and Portuguese began this as an edict from Shabtai Tzvi, and they never stopped doing it. So next time that the Sephardim tell you, hey, we're much better than you, we do duchening every Shabbos, remind them it was started by Shabtai Tzvi in 1650. Shoots, this is being broadcast live on Facebook. Maybe we shouldn't say that. But it's interesting how things, it's a minhag, we've always done it like this. Yeah, it got lost in the passage of time, but that minhag began by Shabtai Tzvi. But in 1671, the Jews in Amsterdam, they want to get life back to normal again. What is life back to normal? Let me just open up for you so you can see what life back to normal means. Actually, before I do, just want to show you here, Menashe ben Yisrael. That's Menashe ben Yisrael. That's a portrait of him from 1642. Now let's see, can we get you the, okay, that one's closed there. There are a couple more. I just want you to see at the moment here. Here it is over here. There we go. This allows, yes, it will allow there. That's not the one. Either that one there. Let's get over here. Here, this is what normal life means to Jews in Amsterdam. This is a bris milah, circumcision of a Sephardi family in 1668, supposed to be the family of Moses Curiel da Acosta. Here you have the moil, the baby there. The mother is still back here. He's in the corner in an inset on a four-poster bed. Everyone's around. The women standing right at the front. It's life back to normal again. Let's just have Judaism carrying on as normal. Before we do that, though, we should be able to. This is an engraving of Shabtai Tzvi. But bearing in mind, we're at the time here now of Van Dyck. You know, there are qualified portraits of the people who we are speaking about. So they want to have large shuls. They start building in 1671. What happened in 1672, Jonathan? We're in Amsterdam. What happened in 1672?
They developed a new impaling stick.
No, sorry. It wasn't
sorry.
the imperial stick. It was the British. The year of the calamity. The English ships and the armies of Louis XIV. And the French invasion was so sudden that how did they stop it?
Yeah. They opened the dams.
We're correct, Chai Bracha. They opened up the dams. They opened up the dikes of Amsterdam in order, that was the only way to do it, to flood their entire city in order to stop the British and the French. Once things have calmed down, they start to open up shuls. Of course, in order to open up the shuls, you got the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. What do? They compete. They're 100 yards down the road from one another. They're competing with each other. I just want to read a description of the Sephardi shul, the Esnoga. In order, by the way, the Ashkenazim hired Elias Bouman, who'd worked on the Oosterkerk and most of the other monuments. He worked under Daniel Stalpert, who built the churches and the massive East India Company's warehouse. The Sephardim outdid themselves, and on the 23rd of November, 1670, Isaac Abor de Fonseca delivered a sermon in the shul, appealing for funds. He raised 40,000 guilders, nearly half the cost, after one speech. But he wasn't going to be outdone, and another grandee from the Sotter family offered to advance 100,000 guilder on the condition of his schedule. He wanted to set the schedule of the repayment. He was declined by the Mamad, which was filled with millionaires in houses in the country and bulging bank accounts. When I was working in Chigwell, the Rav had gone to do a wedding in America. When this was not long after September the 11th, it was within 12 months of it. And when he's there, the Rav in the shul in America got up, he was doing a speech. They wanted to put up video surveillance and this, that, and the other. They were spending an absolute fortune on doing it. And the Rav turned around and he says, right, you'll give this, you'll give that, you'll give the other. And one man stood up and says, what am I, chopped liver? I'll give you $10,000. He was annoyed he hadn't been asked to give. So, you know, it was, they wanted to give the money, they build it. They build it, they both have 2 plots of land. I'm just going to read, and I've got a picture of it, of the Sephardi synagogue called the Esnoga, bathed in light. Going to be massive difference to the Gothic spaces of the medieval shuls, which were often built for shelter and safety. Doesn't really work. Its roof was 100 feet high. There were 3 rows of windows, square on the ground floor, and on the top floor lighting the windows, the women's gallery. Between them were stupendously tall arched windows, 5 on the front and rear walls, and 7 along the side. So 7 and 5 each one, making up a total of 12. You had on each side, and so north and east with 12, south and west would also have 12 windows. It would be like the grandest of the Calvinist churches. The dimensions of the shul, 130 feet long, 100 feet wide, space for 1,200 men downstairs and 400 women upstairs in the galleries. One of the inaugural sermons claimed it was only a little bit smaller than Solomon's temple. The Teva and the Heichel were made of oak with a veneer of Pernambuco rosewood. No idea what it was. This was the most expensive of all timbers. A forest of brass chandeliers held 800 candles. If anybody's ever been to Beavis Marks Shul and seen it down a Friday night with the candles, it's beautiful. Here you have a chandelier with 800 candles. By the time you get to light the last candle, the first one's has burned out already. They were all lit on Shabbos, Friday evening, 2nd of August, 1679 for the inauguration. Everyone came along, not just the Jews, the non-Jews as well, the city sheriff. It was the eve of Shabbos Nachamu, when we read, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort ye my people. My father's bar mitzvah sefer. For such a local redemption, you don't even need to have a Mashiach. This is what we're doing over here. Following on from that, and the very last thing.
Excuse me, Rabbi, are there any pictures of that shul?
Yes, of course, got picture of the shul. What did you picture of the shul? A picture of the shul. This is make sure we get the right one. There we go. This is of the inauguration. This is the inauguration of the shul. You can see the great big pillars. Supposedly by the inauguration of that shul of where it was done over there. It was destroyed, of course, by the Germans, I believe, at the beginning of the Second World War. But sorry, Alan?
I say it's a bit like Princess Road.
Well, they were all built by, yes, it followed along the same one. But I've got 1 or 2 o'clock. I just want to finish off one short thing. I've mentioned him in a sermon before, a man by the name of Yaakov Yuda Leon Templo. What he wants to do, he wanted people to understand where the grandeur of the shul came from, and he makes a model of the second Beis HaMikdash according to how it was expanded by Herod. In 1661, he'd been forbidden from opening up the model to paying visitors on a Shabbos. This model goes here, there, and everywhere. It gets shown to the members of the Royal Society, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Charles II. Templo comes along to England in order, it caused a great stir amongst the scientists. And some say that this is what spurred Isaac Newton to embark on his weighty multi-year project about the Solomon Temple, which caused him to say as to the size of the Amma. Bearing in mind, this is in 1674. Not long earlier, in 1656, was when Spinoza said that the size of the Beis HaMikdash was totally wrong. Solomon wouldn't even have known the amount of mass necessary to do that. He would have just about known the difference between a circumference and a diameter. And so, that was why Spinoza gets in trouble with the Christians as well, because he starts to question biblical criticism. The Old Testament, they don't like that. Judah Templo does it. The model remains in England. It's supposedly still on show in 1680. The scientist Robert Hooke recorded having a discussion with Isaac Newton about it. In 1771, a newspaper in The Hague reported it saying that this temple can be purchased by anybody. And by 1778, it comes back to England, owned by an MP de Castro, with a new book, a new edition called An Accurate Description of the Grand and Glorious Temple of Solomon. It's not been seen since. So if anybody has got a model of the Beis HaMikdash that is 300 years old, you may have the one built by Templo. That, my dear friends, takes us to the end of this tumultuous century. It's taken us 2 weeks. We've got through it. Next century that we get through, as I say, has got the repercussions from Shabtai Tzvi with the arguments amongst the rabbis, which got crazy. And if we're lucky, we will also start with the beginning of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I wish you a long life for Friday.
For David Kennedy.
I wish you a long life for Friday. You got Yorkside Friday.
Friday night Shabbos.
I wish you a long life.
Thank you very much.
And me, David.
And of course, forgive me, I'm teaching at 2 o'clock. I've got to run.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right.